Okay, moving on, let's talk a little bit about how we name, classify, and identify microorganisms. All right, so there's a term that you should associate with classification of living things, and that is taxonomy. So the people who study classification of living things, get really into that type of thing, are called taxonomists. So taxonomy is the study of how living things are classified. And this course, because almost everybody who's taken this class is planning a career in the health sciences, you're probably not planning to become a biologist or a microbiologist. If this was a traditional microbiology class for biology or microbiology majors, then we would spend more time on classification and taxonomy. But in this class, we're just going to kind of hit some highlights, some key points about it. All right, first of all, I want to point out to you common names versus scientific names. So all living things have a scientific name, and we want to use those scientific names as much as possible in this course. So here's an example of a scientific name, Escherichia coli or Escherichia coli. There are a couple of different pronunciations for that. Apparently Escherichia is the correct pronunciation, but Escherichia is what most people say. So sometimes people don't always use the correct pronunciations. All right, so all living things have a scientific name like this. Two parts. The first name is the genus name. Second name is the species. All right, so a genus is a group of closely related living things, very closely related. The species is the individual particular type of microorganism. So Escherichia or Escherichia coli is a particular species within the genus Escherichia or Escherichia. So there are other species within that genus. You kind of think of genus as almost like a last name, maybe. Species is like the first name, but they're written in reverse order. And hopefully, what else are you noticing about the way the scientific name is written? The genus name over here is always capitalized. Species name is always lowercase. Also notice they're underlined. So if you're typing it out, what are you going to do? It's kind of like a book title. You want to italicize if you're typing the name out. If you're handwriting it, you always underline. Capitalized genus, species is always lowercase. Now, if you were writing a paragraph about Escherichia coli, the first time you mention it, you want to spell out the entire name. After that, it is okay to abbreviate. So you could abbreviate as E. coli from that point forward. That's probably how you guys have heard of Escherichia coli before. You've heard about it as E. coli. But technically, the first time you mention it or write it out, you are supposed to spell out that genus name the first time. And that's important because there are other living things out there that might have E. coli as an abbreviation. You may have another genus that starts with the letter E, so you want to be very, very clear about which organism you're talking about when you're writing about it or speaking about it. So be sure you know those rules about how you name organisms. Think about human beings. What's our genus and species? Genus is Homo, species is sapiens, Homo sapiens. So you would write that with a capital H, lowercase s, underline if you're writing it out, or italicize if you're typing it. Now, some genuses or genera is really the correct plural for genus, have only one species. For example, with Homo sapiens, we're the only species in the genus Homo. Now, in the past, there have been other animals in the genus Homo, but they no longer exist. They've gone extinct. A good example would be Homo neanderthalensis. We've all heard of Neanderthal men before, and Neanderthal men are now extinct, but they were a species within the genus Homo, and there's some other examples of that as well. So a genus is a group of very closely related living things. Or a little bit more about classification of organisms. So there are different levels of classification. The broadest groups of living things are called domains. So we have a domain called the bacteria, the archaea, and the eukarya. Those are your broadest groups. Now, maybe back in grade school, junior high, middle school, whatever, you may have learned that living things are divided up into kingdoms, phylum, classes, families, etc., and etc. And so you may have learned that that top level of classification was kingdoms. Kingdoms, though, under traditional methods for classification, exist only in this domain. So domains are actually above the kingdom level. Kingdoms are things like plants and animals and fungi and protists, like they're showing you over here. That's the kingdom level of classification. So the domain level is broader. So the domain eukarya, for example, includes all of your eukaryotic living things. And those, that big group, that big domain, can be divided up into the plant, animal, fungus, and protozoan kingdoms. And then from there, they get subdivided into smaller and smaller and smaller groups of living things. All right, your prokaryotes are divided up into two domains. We have the domain bacteria, and then we have the domain archaea. And this class will mainly focus in on the domain bacteria when we're talking about prokaryotic organisms, but the archaea are also in the prokaryotic category. Then they're showing you here on this diagram from your text. The big domain of bacteria is divided up into smaller groups of living things based on some of their characteristics that we'll be learning about this semester. And same thing for the domain archaea. And this is supposed to be an evolutionary relationship diagram, so they're showing you that in the distant past, billions of years ago, there was some ancestral cell line, the first living cells on Earth, from which, over long periods of time, lots of evolutionary processes, these different domains of organisms developed. Okay, so take a look in your textbook at this classification scheme, which is showing us over here, Homo sapiens, versus a single-celled protozoan called a paramecium, which you may have looked at. You know, maybe if you looked at pond water back in middle school or high school in a biology or life science class, you may have seen paramecia swimming in the pond water. So they're little single-cell protozoans that commonly live in water. What they're trying to show you on this diagram are different levels of communication, classification for two different types of eukaryotes. So human beings and paramecia are in the domain eukarya up at the top. Your eukaryotes are divided into kingdoms. So as humans, we're in the domain Animalia. I'm sorry, we're in the kingdom Animalia. The paramecium is in the kingdom Protista. And then from there, kingdoms are divided into, if you're a kingdom, you're divided into different phylums or phyla. And then phyla are divided into classes. For example, we're in the class Mammalia. Classes are divided into more closely related living things called orders. We're in the order Primates. And then orders are divided into families. So we're in the family Hominoidea. And if you look over on the right-hand side of the diagram, the Paramecia are in their own family. And finally, you get down to the genus level. So you have all these Hominoidea family members that are divided up into genera of more closely related organisms. And again, we're in the genus Homo, and we're the only species that currently exists on the planet in that particular genus. Then among your Paramecia, that's going to be a genus that's going to have more than one type of species in it. That's just giving you a feel for those different levels of classification. All right, so that's going to wrap up Chapter 1. And again, be sure you're using your study guide learning objectives for Chapter 1 to review, do your homework activities, the after reading and video lectures homework, And I would take your quiz. You go ahead and knock those types of things out. That's going to kind of force you to review all of the content and then move on to chapter 2. That's the ideal way to do the class, is to try to take it chapter by chapter. You've just got to really stay on top of things and stay on schedule in order to be able to do that, rather than having lots of things due all at the same time and you're having to go back and do multiple chapters at once to try to get all of your assignments done on the deadline date. So key thing there is to try to stay on top of things and move through things one chapter at a time. Keep in mind, though, that you do need to be working on your virtual lab assignments. You can't put those off because they're pretty time consuming. So you're going to want to work those simultaneously as you're going through your textbook chapter content as well. But anyway, we'll be moving on to chapter 2. We're not going to cover all of the content in chapter 2. We're going to hit some highlights on culturing microorganisms and then also on microscopy.